The camera was never meant to hear that. The angle was never meant to hold. And once William saw the footage, nothing was left open to interpretation. His response was swift. If this moment felt carefully hidden, that's because it was. Power inside the palace rarely confronts, it recalibrates. The lockdown. Once the response was in motion, the palace turned to containment. Not of people, of exposure. The footage itself was never going to be released publicly. That decision was made almost instantly. Not to protect Camilla, and not to shield Catherine, but to prevent the institution from being dragged into a narrative it did not control. The monarchy does not argue with images, it neutralizes them. The clip was reclassified, its circulation restricted to a narrow internal tier. Metadata was reviewed. Access logs were frozen. The question was not how the footage had been captured, accidents happen, but how close it had come to slipping into the wrong hands. That proximity alone was treated as a warning. New protocols followed. Audio handling tightened. Transitional moments, once considered harmless, were redefined as vulnerable. The palace does not wait for repetition to justify prevention. Simultaneously, the narrative vacuum was addressed. When an internal storyline collapses, it must be replaced immediately, not with contradiction, but with clarity. Catherine's role was affirmed quietly, repeatedly, across channels that mattered. Language sharpened, descriptions aligned. There would be no ambiguity left to reinterpret. What had once been hedged was now stated. The future queen was not emerging, she was established. Camilla was never confronted about the footage. That omission was intentional. Acknowledgement would have elevated the moment into something disputable. Silence, by contrast, allowed the institution to reset without granting her a platform to reframe intent. Instead, boundaries were enforced through structure. Her advisory reach narrowed further. Her presence became ceremonial rather than connective. She remained visible, but influence no longer flowed through her. This was not punishment, it was insulation. The palace does not remove figures, it can reposition. By the end of the lockdown phase, the risk had been neutralized on every front. The footage existed, but it no longer mattered. The pattern it revealed had been dismantled. The narrative it supported had been replaced. Catherine moved forward untouched by the episode, at least publicly. Her composure never shifted. Her conduct never acknowledged disruption. That restraint, intentional or not, sealed the outcome because in the monarchy, stability is not declared, it is demonstrated, and Catherine demonstrated it effortlessly. The lockdown did more than contain a moment, it closed a chapter. What remained was the silence afterwards. The kind that confirms a decision has been made and will not be revisited, which left only one question unresolved. Not how this happened, but what it changed. The response. William acted within hours, not publicly, not emotionally, but decisively, in the only way that matters inside the palace, by changing the architecture through which influence moved. The first adjustment was access. Meetings that had once been broad became narrow. Briefings once circulated widely were now routed selectively. Catherine's schedule, previously filtered through layers of concern and coordination, was reclassified as priority business, not supportive, not supplementary, but central. No announcement accompanied this shift. Announcements invite resistance. Instead, the change was felt gradually, then all at once. William requested a private review of Catherine's initiatives, not to assess their impact, but to formalize their authority. Projects once described as collaborative were reattributed with precision. Language hardened. Ownership was clarified. Where ambiguity had lived, definition replaced it. The second move was symbolic, though symbols inside the monarchy are never merely aesthetic. Catherine's presence at key engagements increased, not dramatically but deliberately. She appeared where stability was being discussed, where continuity mattered, where the future was being quietly modeled for those paying attention. This was not defiance, it was anchoring. Camilla was not excluded outright, That would have escalated the situation unnecessarily. Instead, she found herself adjacent rather than central, informed rather than consulted, present, but no longer shaping the frame. The difference was unmistakable. William did not speak to her about the footage. He did not need to. The institution was speaking on his behalf. The third move was internal alignment. William convened a small group, trusted, disciplined, immune to sentiment, and made his position clear without referencing personalities. There would be no narrative framing Catherine as a variable. There would be no hedging around her role. There would be no quiet recalibration of her influence. Any such attempts would be treated not as concern, but as interference. That language mattered because interference carries constitutional weight. Once that boundary was drawn, behavior adjusted rapidly. The palace does not test lines it knows will hold. Camilla sensed the shift almost immediately. Influence, once lost, announces itself through absence. Conversations shortened. Invitations arrived later. Her perspective, once solicited reflexively, now followed after decisions were already formed. Nothing about her role changed publicly. Everything about it changed privately. William did not gloat. He did not press. He did not seek acknowledgement. His objective was not victory. It was finality. The message was unmistakable. Catherine's position was not open to interpretation. Her role was not subject to management. Her future was not a variable to be discussed behind her back. Those days were over. By the end of the week, the pattern that had taken months to form had collapsed. Not because it was exposed, but because it was rendered irrelevant. William had not argued against it. He had replaced it, and in doing so, he made something clear to everyone watching closely, that when Catherine is positioned as anything less than inevitable, the response will not be delayed. It will be immediate. The context. The footage did not create the tension. It exposed it. For months prior, Catherine's position inside the monarchy had been quietly consolidating. Not through ambition, not through maneuvering, but through something far more destabilizing to established power, competence paired with public trust. Her schedule had expanded while others contracted. Her appearances drew sustained attention without controversy. She spoke less, but when she did, it landed. The public read steadiness where the institution desperately needed it. Inside the palace, this was noticed, not with applause but with calculation. Catherine did not seek influence. That was the problem. Influence followed her regardless. She represented continuity without nostalgia, tradition without rigidity. She absorbed pressure without broadcasting it, and crucially, she strengthened William without eclipsing him. For those accustomed to power flowing through proximity and persuasion, this dynamic was unsettling. Catherine did not negotiate her relevance. She embodied it. That alone would have been manageable. What complicated matters was timing. The monarchy was already under strain. Health concerns lingered in the background. Public patience had thinned. The next generation was no longer theoretical. In that environment, Catherine's growing authority did not feel organic to everyone. To some, it felt accelerated, and acceleration inside the palace triggers instinctive resistance. Camilla's unease had been building quietly. She had spent decades navigating suspicion, earning legitimacy inch by inch. She understood the cost of public affection and the resentment it breeds internally. Where Catherine was embraced without struggle, Camilla had been tested relentlessly. That contrast mattered more than anyone admitted. In private conversations, Catherine's role was increasingly discussed in abstract terms. Optics, pressure, visibility. The language was never personal, which made it easier to disguise intent. Concerns were framed as protective. Is she being overexposed? Is the public expecting too much too soon? Does her influence complicate balance within the household? Each question appeared reasonable in isolation. Together, they formed a narrative, one that suggested Catherine was becoming central too quickly. The footage captured that narrative mid-construction. Camilla was not venting, she was aligning. testing receptivity, establishing shared concern. The nod from the listener mattered as much as the words themselves. It meant the idea was already circulating. William, watching this with the benefit of distance, understood the danger immediately. This was not rivalry. It was preemption. An attempt to shape how Catherine would be perceived internally before she could no longer be reframed. Once a future queen is treated as a stabilizing force rather than a variable, the window for influence closes. Camilla was acting inside that window. What she misjudged was William's threshold. He had tolerated complexity around himself. He had absorbed pressure. He had allowed ambiguity where it preserved unity, but Catherine occupied a different category. She was not negotiable, not contextual, not a topic for strategic concern. She was the future queen consort, and once that role is questioned behind closed doors, the issue ceases to be interpersonal. It becomes structural. The footage did not anger William. It clarified him because it confirmed something he had suspected but hoped was untrue, that Catherine's rise was being quietly resisted by those who believed influence should be earned through endurance rather than capability. That resistance could not be allowed to calcify. Not now, not ever. William understood that delay would only legitimize the narrative forming around her. Silence would be read as consent. And consent, once assumed, becomes precedent. So he did not wait and did not consult widely. He did not seek reassurance. He acted immediately. After the line was drawn. What followed was not reconciliation. It was reordering. The palace returned to its outward rhythm with practiced precision. Engagements proceeded. Statements remained unchanged. Smiles held. To the outside world, nothing had occurred that required explanation. That was intentional. The monarchy does not correct narratives by addressing them. It corrects them by rendering them obsolete. Inside, however, the recalibration was permanent. Catherine's role no longer traveled through interpretation. It was no longer contextualized, moderated, or softened for internal comfort. The language surrounding her settled into something final. She was not emerging. She was not being prepared. She was not gaining influence. She had it. That shift altered more than scheduling or access. It altered behavior. Conversations adjusted their tone. Assumptions realigned. The subtle permissions once granted to question pace or presence quietly evaporated. No one announced this change. They adapted to it. Catherine herself did nothing to mark the moment. No visible assertion, no altered posture, no public acknowledgement of protection or conflict. She continued exactly as she had before, composed, disciplined, unreactive. That continuity did more than any directive could have. It made the outcome feel inevitable rather than enforced. Camilla understood the finality before anyone articulated it. There was no confrontation, no apology demanded, no private reckoning staged for closure. The institution does not require emotional resolution to function. It requires compliance with boundaries once they are drawn. Her influence did not vanish. It narrowed. She remained central in ceremonial life, present, respected, publicly unchallenged. But the informal corridors where persuasion once traveled, the half-conversations, the anticipatory concern, the shaping of narratives before they reached daylight, those corridors closed, quietly and permanently. For someone who had survived decades by reading the room before others noticed the temperature change, the message was unmistakable. This was not about punishment. It was about prevention. William, for his part, did not revisit the moment. He did not allow it to harden into grievance or linger as a reference point. His response had never been emotional. It had been structural, and structures, once corrected, do not require rehearsal. What changed most was not what anyone said. It was who was trusted. William's internal circle tightened. Decision-making insulated itself from sentiment. The family dimension of governance, long blurred for the sake of harmony, became more clearly delineated from the institutional one. This was not cruelty, it was learning. The monarchy does not forget moments like this. It absorbs them. It stores them in process, in protocol, in who is present when futures are discussed and who is not. The camera had captured seconds. The consequence reshaped years. From that point forward, Catherine's position was treated as non-negotiable, not because William demanded loyalty, but because the institution recognized clarity when it saw it. Any future attempt to reframe her role would not be debated. It would simply fail to gain traction, because traction depends on ambiguity, and ambiguity had been removed. The deeper fracture was quieter. Trust, once narrowed, rarely expands again. The family would continue to function. Appearances would remain seamless. Language would stay warm. But the shared assumption of alignment, that influence and intention naturally flowed in the same direction, had been corrected. Not everyone moves forward together. Some move aside. The palace accepted this without comment. It always does. And the final lesson of the moment was not about cameras or conversations or even intent. It was about timing. The window to shape Catherine's role had closed, not with argument, not with exposure, but with immediacy. William had acted before the pattern could harden, before resistance could become precedent, before the future could be quietly negotiated without his consent. That was the true consequence of the footage. Not scandal, not humiliation, but a line drawn so cleanly that it never needed to be defended again. Because in this family, the most decisive power is not the one that speaks the loudest. It is the one that moves first, and then says nothing at all. The palace locks down. Once William's response was in motion, the institution did what it has done for centuries. When an internal fault line becomes visible, it closed ranks. The priority was no longer correction. That had already happened. The priority now was prevention, ensuring the moment captured by the camera could never repeat itself, and that whatever had been revealed would not metastasize into rumor, speculation, or competing narratives. The footage itself was contained within hours. Access was restricted. Internal circulation logs were sealed. The clip was reclassified as non-operational material, its relevance rendered moot by the structural changes already enacted. In the palace's logic, neutralization is more effective than suppression. You do not fight an image. You make it irrelevant. Simultaneously, a quiet reset took place around narrative discipline. Language matters more than statements inside the monarchy. How roles are described internally determines how they are respected externally. Catherine's position was now referred to with finality, not in aspirational terms, not in preparatory language. She was treated as the fixed center of the future. Briefings aligned accordingly. Staff were not instructed, they adjusted. The palace does not require explanation when direction is clear. Those who shape language sensed immediately that the margin for reinterpretation had closed. What had once been described as balance was now described as clarity. Camilla felt the lockdown not as reprimand, but as absence. Conversations that once included her perspective no longer required it. Strategy meetings proceeded without her early input. She remained present at ceremonial moments, visible and composed. But the connective influence that once bridged private concern and institutional action had been deliberately severed. This was not humiliation. It was insulation. The monarchy protects itself by limiting the pathways through which personal anxiety can become institutional behavior. The camera had revealed such a pathway. William had closed it. No public narrative emerged because none was needed. The absence of reaction was itself the message. The palace does not validate internal friction by acknowledging it publicly. Instead, it demonstrates stability. Catherine continued her work uninterrupted. Her composure never wavered. There was no visible acknowledgement of disruption, no signaling of vulnerability. That restraint did more to cement her position than any formal declaration could have. Stability in this institution is not announced, it is performed. By the time the lockdown phase ended, the risk had been fully neutralized. The footage existed, but it no longer carried power. The concern it had exposed had been structurally overridden. The narrative it might have fueled had been replaced with something stronger: inevitability. What remained was silence. Not the silence of avoidance, the silence of resolution. And within that silence, one truth had been quietly affirmed. Catherine's role was no longer subject to internal negotiation. Anyone who failed to recognize that was no longer misreading the moment. They were standing on the wrong side of it. William acts immediately. William did not convene a family discussion. He did not seek reassurance. He did not test reactions. He did not ask for explanations that could be shaped after the fact. The footage had already done what confrontation never could. It clarified intent without argument, and clarity eliminates delay. Within hours, he began changing the internal geometry of decision-making. The first move was procedural, not personal. William requested a consolidation of forward planning, briefings, succession, public continuity, and household coordination under a tighter review structure. The language was neutral. The effect was decisive. Information that had once flowed laterally now moved vertically, with fewer hands shaping it before it reached him. The second move was positional. Catherine was no longer framed as supportive presence in those discussions. She was designated as co-principal, not emerging, not preparatory, present. That shift required no announcement. Titles inside the palace matter less than access. Catherine's access expanded. Her briefings deepened. Her visibility at strategically weighted engagements increased, not in volume but in placement. She appeared where the future was being implicitly modeled. William understood symbols, but he trusted structure more. The third move was boundary setting. Without naming the footage, without referencing personalities, he issued a clear internal directive. Future-facing strategy concerning the Princess of Wales would be treated as settled, not provisional. Any narrative framing her role as a variable would be corrected as a matter of record. Correction, not debate. That phrasing mattered. Debate invites persuasion. Correction ends it. Camilla was not confronted. She was repositioned. Her advisory proximity to succession-related planning narrowed. Invitations arrived later. Input was acknowledged after decisions were formed. She remained visible, respected, and ceremonially central. But the connective tissue that once carried influence quietly past formal channels was severed. No one explained this to her. Inside the palace, explanations are for reversals. This was not a reversal. It was a line. William did not raise his voice. He did not signal anger. He did not personalize the response. His authority in this moment came from restraint paired with speed, a combination that leaves little room for resistance. The institution adjusted almost immediately. Staff aligned their language, briefings hardened, ambiguity dissolved. The subtle qualifiers that had once accompanied Catherine's role vanished from internal documents. Helpful became essential. Visible became central. Promising became established. The shift did not provoke open friction because it did not need to. The palace recognizes inevitability when it is clearly enforced. What mattered was not that William acted, it was how little he needed to say. By the end of the week, the pattern the camera had revealed was no longer operational, not argued away, not apologized for, replaced. William's message, delivered without spectacle, was unmistakable. Catherine's position was not open to calibration, commentary, or quiet management. It was fixed, and once fixed, it would be defended not with sentiment, but with structure. The response had been immediate. The consequences would be lasting. What the camera didn't create. The footage did not invent the behavior, it illuminated it. Once William allowed himself to look backward, not emotionally, but analytically, the contours became unmistakable. What had once felt like isolated moments now aligned into a coherent pattern, one that had been forming quietly across recent months. The pattern was not hostility. Hostility would have been easy to challenge. It was management. Catherine had begun to encounter subtle resistance not to her presence, but to her centrality. Invitations framed as helpful contributions rather than core responsibilities. Briefings summarized rather than shared in full. Language that praised her composure while quietly questioning her scope. Nothing overt, nothing actionable. That was precisely the design. Inside the palace, influence is rarely seized. It is rationed, and rationing is most effective when it appears protective rather than restrictive. Camilla had learned this long before Catherine entered the family. She understood the mechanics of survival inside an institution that remembers slights forever and forgives only when necessary. Her power had never come from visibility. It had come from proximity and patience. What the camera captured was not a lapse in discretion. It was a moment of alignment, when private concern was being tested aloud, gauging whether it would be received as reasonable. The words mattered less than the framing. Catherine was not discussed as a threat. She was discussed as a variable. Variables can be adjusted. Variables can be slowed. Variables can be contextualized until they lose momentum. The pattern extended beyond one conversation. William identified it in how Catherine's work was internally described, never minimized, but subtly redistributed. Initiatives she led were framed as collective successes. Her influence was acknowledged, then immediately buffered with language emphasizing institutional balance. Helpful, but not essential. Visible, but not foundational. The most telling sign was what did not happen. There was no effort to integrate Catherine more deeply into future-facing strategy. No urgency to lock her position into the architecture of what came next. Her role was allowed to grow, but only organically, only incrementally, only at a pace others could tolerate. That tolerance was the constraint. William understood then that the issue was not Catherine's performance, it was her inevitability. Once a figure becomes inevitable inside the monarchy, certain forms of influence evaporate. The quiet shaping of outcomes, the gentle steering of decisions, the space where persuasion thrives without attribution. Catherine threatened that space simply by existing as she did. She was trusted without effort. She was believed without explanation. The public did not require translation where she was concerned. That kind of clarity collapses ambiguity, and ambiguity is where informal power lives. What the camera revealed was an attempt to preserve ambiguity while there was still time. Camilla's concern may have been sincerely framed as stewardship, as balance, and as protecting the institution from moving too quickly. But intent is measured not by justification, but by direction, and the direction was clear. Catherine was being quietly repositioned from center to component. William did not need to imagine malice to recognize danger. He also did not need to involve Catherine to confirm his conclusion. Her unguarded confidence, her lack of defensiveness, her continued composure, all confirmed the same truth. She had not provoked this. She had outgrown it. That realization hardened William's resolve because patterns like this do not resolve themselves. Left alone, they become precedent. And precedent, once established, reshapes futures without ever appearing to do so. The camera had removed plausible deniability. What remained was choice. William chose immediacy. He chose structure over discussion, and he chose to act before the pattern could harden into something that required undoing rather than replacement. The footage had not created the problem. It had given him permission to end it. The uneasy ground beneath Catherine. The moment landed so heavily because it did not arrive in a vacuum. For months leading up to it, Catherine's position inside the monarchy had been shifting in ways that were subtle enough to avoid headlines, but unmistakable to those who lived inside the system. Her public presence had grown steadier rather than louder. Her engagements were fewer in number but heavier in meaning. When she appeared, the attention did not spike and vanish. R4, it settled. Inside the palace, that kind of attention is read differently. It is not measured in applause or headlines, but in something far more consequential: trust. Catherine was becoming trusted without effort. She did not campaign for relevance. She did not seek proximity. She did not cultivate influence in private rooms. It arrived anyway. That alone would have been manageable if the institution were calm. It was not. The previous year had been marked by fragility. Health concerns had quietly altered schedules. Long-term planning conversations had moved from hypothetical to urgent. The future was no longer a distant horizon. It was pressing forward, demanding definition. Catherine stood at the center of that future whether anyone had planned for it or not. Her authority did not resemble Camilla's. Where Camilla's influence had been earned through endurance, negotiation, and adaptation over decades, Catherine's was rooted in consistency. She did not reinterpret the institution. She embodied it in a way the public recognized instinctively. That difference mattered. It mattered because institutions built on hierarchy are often unsettled by authority that does not announce itself. Catherine did not ask permission to be stabilizing. She simply was. Private discussions reflected this unease. Her name surfaced more frequently in planning conversations, but not always with clarity. Language began to soften around her role. She was praised, but qualified. Commended, but contextualized. Helpful, but visible, but capable, but each qualifier appeared reasonable. Each suggested care rather than resistance. Together, they formed a narrative that framed Catherine not as inevitable, but as accelerating too quickly. As someone whose influence might need pacing, as a presence that required moderation for the sake of balance. Balance, inside the palace, is often code. It means maintaining existing channels of influence. Camilla understood this instinctively. She had spent years learning how balance was preserved, not by open confrontation, but by calibration, by ensuring no single figure moved so far forward that others were rendered irrelevant. From her perspective, Catherine's rise was not threatening because it was personal. It was threatening because it was structural. Catherine strengthened William without requiring mediation. She did not soften his edges. She clarified them. Their partnership projected cohesion without negotiation. That kind of unity narrows the space where influence can be exercised indirectly. Camilla had survived precisely because she understood those indirect spaces. What the camera captured was not frustration. It was assessment, a moment where concern crossed into alignment, where Catherine's role was discussed as something that could still be shaped if addressed early enough. The timing mattered. Catherine's visibility had increased during a period when internal sensitivity was already heightened. Every appearance carried symbolic weight, every absence was noticed, every adjustment was read for meaning. Camilla's words, recorded unintentionally, landed at precisely the wrong moment, when any suggestion of recalibration felt less like caution and more like obstruction. William understood this instantly. He also understood something else, that Catherine herself was unaware of the conversation. She had continued her role without hesitation, without adjustment, without visible tension. She had not reacted because there had been nothing, outwardly, to react to. That restraint made the moment more serious, not less because it meant the concern existed entirely behind her back. Inside the monarchy, disagreements can be managed. Rivalries can be absorbed. But positioning the future queen as a variable, quietly, strategically, crosses into something far more dangerous. It suggests a willingness to shape perception before reality can assert itself. The footage did not introduce a new conflict. It confirmed an existing one, and confirmation changes everything. William did not need to speculate about motive. He did not need to interpret tone. He did not need to consider alternative explanations. The context had already been building. The camera simply removed deniability. What followed would not be emotional. It would not be reactive. It would not be framed as defense. It would be corrective because once the ground beneath Catherine was shown to be unstable even quietly, it had to be reinforced immediately. Not for appearances, for the future, and that reinforcement would not involve discussion. It would involve action. The moment that should have been silent. It lasted less than half a minute. No raised voices, no visible confrontation, no dramatic gestures that could be dismissed as frustration or fatigue. The exchange unfolded quietly, off to the side of a routine engagement during a transition most cameras are trained to ignore. However, this one didn't. A microphone remained open longer than intended. A lens held its frame just long enough, And in that narrow window, a conversation meant to dissolve into the air was captured intact. Camilla's voice was calm, measured, unhurried. There was no anger in it, which made it far more dangerous. She did not criticize Catherine directly. She did something far more strategic. She questioned her positioning, her influence, her effect on William's future decision-making. Each point framed as concern, each sentence softened with the language of responsibility. It sounded reasonable. That was the problem. She spoke of pressure, of visibility, of how certain roles might be evolving too quickly. She suggested that unchecked momentum could complicate the balance the palace had worked so hard to maintain. The implication was unmistakable. Catherine was being discussed not as the future, but as a factor to be managed. The person listening did not interrupt. A brief nod followed, subtle, affirming. Then footsteps approached. Smiles returned instantly. The moment closed as cleanly as it had opened. No one present reacted, but the footage did not disappear. It entered internal review days later, flagged not for sound quality or framing, but for content, the language, the subject, the context. By the time it reached William, the date on the file placed it firmly in recent weeks, a period already marked by heightened sensitivity around succession, health concerns, and future visibility. William watched it once. He did not rewind it. He did not ask for explanation. What he saw was not a mistake, not a slip, not exhaustion. It was intent. The camera had not created the moment. It had revealed it, and that revelation crossed a line that could not be softened, delayed, or reinterpreted. This was not about internal disagreement. It was about Catherine, and when Catherine is positioned as a liability rather than a certainty, William does not wait for consensus. Instead, he acts, immediately. Subscribe for deeper royal stories where silence reveals more than statements ever could. Share your thoughts below, pass this on, and stay with us as we continue uncovering what happens when cameras stop rolling, but influence never does.